You are listening to Essence, a podcast about story, journey, and self. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Essence, a podcast about journey, story, and self. On today's episode, which is episode 15, we're going to talk with Morgan Daimler, a pagan author and writer of urban fantasy fiction. Morgan I've been following for the past couple of years, and a lot of the content around Irish fairy lore inevitably leads back to Morgan in some way. They are a prolific writer. They have 38 titles under their belt as of last count, and that being said, I last counted about 6 months ago, so there's probably a lot more now. Morgan started out really connected with deity and has now shifted over the years to working exclusively with the fairies of Irish tradition. And what I was really curious, and why I wanted Morgan on the show, what I was really curious about was the journey that took them from working with deity and specifically figures like Morrigan and those figures to working with the fairies particularly. And I was curious because when you look at or when you listen to a lot of the content of the podcast interviews that they've done, they focus mostly on the work. They focus mostly on the content of their writings as opposed to the journey of how they got there. So I was really, really curious about them as a person, about kind of what brought them to these practices. We had a really great chat afterwards. I think we spoke for 3 hours afterwards, which was really delightful. And again, I was very curious about what was their story as opposed to what was their story as an author, or what was their story as an urban fantasy writer. What was their story as an individual and a member of the community? So I have to apologize. This was recorded 6 months ago, and ever since then, because of so many other things in my life, I haven't had a chance to sit down and edit it and get it up. But today it was time, and I want to apologize for Morgan for not having put that out there so quickly. But here we are. So I hope that you enjoy listening to this interview as much as I enjoyed conducting it, and we will look forward to having Morgan on in the future at some point. There we go. Hello everybody, welcome to the show. This is episode 2 of season 2 of Essence, a podcast all about journey, story, and self. And on today's show, I have a prolific writer who delves mostly in the spiritual and non-fiction areas, but a lot of academic work as well, and who has had quite a journey as well. And I'm very interested to hear about this journey because you don't hear much about it. You hear a lot about your focus, but we never really see behind the curtains. So I'm very much looking forward to connecting with you. Morgan Daimler is, let me see here. Morgan Daimler is a witch who has been a polytheist since the early 90s, following a path inspired by the Irish fairy faith, blended with neo-pagan witchcraft. Morgan teaches classes in Irish myth and magical practices, fairies, and related subjects, both in the United States and internationally. Morgan has been published in multiple anthologies, as well as in Witches and Pagans magazine, Pagan Dawn magazine, and the CR journal, RNFesque. And I thank Morgan for telling me how to pronounce that, because my Irish is very, very, very rusty. She is one of the world's we're not going to use that word. You're one of the world's leading raters on all things fairy. Are you comfortable with leading raters?
We'll go with that, yeah.
Leading writers on all things fairy, and besides the titles available through Moon Books, which has published many of her works, Morgan has self-published a book of Old and Middle Irish languages, translations called The Treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, and an urban fantasy paranormal romance series called Between the Worlds. Altogether, Morgan has written 39 publications, and they are available throughout the world, because you've been translated into multiple languages now, haven't you?
Yep, I have. Several of my books through Moon have been translated into, I think there's 3 in French right now, and 4 more pending, and then 2 in German.
Wow. What was that like to see those copies in German and French?
It was actually a lot of fun.
Mm,
I speak German, although I'm not as good with it now. I was fluent at
mm.
one point, but it is true what they say: if you don't use it, you lose it.
You lose
So
it. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not as fluent as I was 20 years ago. Um, but it was exciting to see that, and then the French. I'm gonna have to learn French now, obviously, so that I can read my own books in French. But yeah, it's exciting to see it. I was getting contacted by people asking for it in different languages, and for people who don't do translation work, even if you wrote the book
Mm,
and you speak the second language, or fluent in another language, it's very tedious and time consuming
mm.
to translate. So it's not something that I'm in a position to do for myself, for my own stuff. So I was thrilled.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you do translation work yourself. You know what that process is like from the other side too. So I definitely appreciate that. But even just to be able to see your own work and your name written on that must have been an amazing feeling.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's nice to know that the material is reaching a wider audience. One of my big motivators for writing a lot of it, especially the pagan portals with the different Irish deities, and a few of the Norse ones, is to try to get the information out there.
Yeah.
So being able to go beyond just an English language audience is fabulous.
Absolutely, absolutely. And well, I mean, let's talk about some of your work before we dive into that personal aspect. One thing that has struck me about your work is the level of scholarship that goes into it. And I know, like knowing mutual friends of ours and reading your material, I can see the amount of not only attention to detail, but the attention to removing the bullshit, especially the biased bullshit from 100 years ago, from some of those very English centric kind of views, the folklorists who are troopsing through the savage land, let's talk a little bit about your work. It mostly focuses on the fairies, but you have other work. But let's focus on the fairies for a bit. You're obviously a priestess of the good people. How did that process come, and what's the journey of that?
Oh, that is such a complicated story.
I know.
So, um, I mean, it's always been an interest for me. It's been an interest spiritually, and it's also been an interest intellectually. I always sort of lived with a feeling that there was this connection that I had, whether I wanted it or not. It was there. And then that sort of pushed me into the intellectual aspect of studying and researching it. So there's that whole thing that was going on, but I had never really seen it as something that would be a primary focus
Mm,
for my spirituality or my life. And then I went to Ireland in 2016. I was actually co-leading a tour with author Stephanie Woodfield, who's a friend of mine, for the Morrigan. It was
mm,
supposed to be a Morrigan Sacred Sites tour. I shouldn't say supposed to be. It was a Morrigan Sacred Sites tour. But the point of doing it was supposed to be to like deepen that connection, and the Irish deities were a important factor for me spiritually. And pretty much from the moment we got there, everything for me kind of went sideways. And I found that everything was kind of focusing, um, not intentionally on my part, on the good folk. And I could tell you there were so many stories that happened. We were only there for, I think it was 11 or 12 days. So it's a ridiculous amount of things that happened in that short amount of time. And I ended up very, not just unintentionally, but sort of unwittingly, unknowingly, engaging in this initiatory experience
mm.
with the she, which was a little complicated. It happened in a couple different parts. I wrote about it later, so you can find different stuff online where I kind of talk about exactly how it happened. But it changed my perspective on a lot of things, particularly on the subject of initiation. And I had always approached that. I should also preface all of this by saying I do have a bachelor's in psychology, so I love me a good psych explanation for everything. I had always approached initiation as a very human ceremony where, yes, you are connecting to the gods and you're asking the gods to bless or interact with something, but it's something that humans initiate, no pun intended, and, humans engage in, and it affects humans on a psychological and a spiritual level. But I'd always kind of had this very set understanding of it. And then I found myself in this situation, which was completely foreign to that, where I wasn't choosing to do it. It hadn't been arranged and set up by me or by a group of other humans. It just was something that I felt was spontaneously happening. Afterwards, of course, pretty much everyone who ever knew me was just like, really, everyone saw this coming, apparently, except for me. But that ended up happening, and that really was a 180 for me, in changing my focus and my understanding of a lot of different things. So I realize that's a slightly rambling answer to the question.
No. Well, even within that, I remember, and I'm glad you brought up your psychology degree, because I remember a few weeks ago I'd asked you about what your thoughts on applying that psychological lens to the interpretation of fairy tales and folklore. And that's something that I've been really sitting in myself, kind of working between those two worlds, right? Because what you've just explained, there is something more powerful about the experiential versus the psychological interpretation, right? And it sounds like there was almost like an ancestral calling back to the experiential for you.
I definitely think there was something much deeper going on. And after that, it's hard to believe it was almost 5 years ago now. It really did change my perspective on how much experience and experiential things matter versus the explanations and the psychology of it, if you will. And I definitely do think I have a different viewpoint today where, as I had said when we were discussing this a few weeks ago, I try to keep the psychological explanation out as much as possible and just relay the experience. Because I think too often when we try to, particularly as third parties, when we try to overlay our own interpretation based in whether it's psychology or anything else, quite honestly, we end up altering what it is we're relaying and changing it into something else. And I think it's better to just pass on and share the actual story or anecdote or, whatever it is, and let it be an experience for the person hearing it the same way as it was an experience for the person who went through it. And then they can parse it however they want to.
Love that. I love that. It reminds me, a mutual friend of ours, Brian Walsh, up here in Canada.
He's amazing.
Oh, I love Brian Walsh. And he taught me a great deal about storytelling when I was first starting my foray into that. And there was that piece about that relationship between the listener and the teller, and the again, it's that experiential piece. You can lay all sorts of interpretations and that mental understanding, but when it comes to actually experiencing a piece, it first of all makes it relevant to now, makes it very intimate, and it allows that person to take it and embody it, right?
Yep, there's something, because as you'd mentioned in the very lovely introduction you did for me, I do also write fiction. And there's something that a lot of fiction authors are kind of told. It's sort of like you're handed the instructions when you initially start writing fiction. And it's that you want to show, not tell. And I think any sort of storytelling, the ultimate purpose is you want the reader or the person listening, or whatever the media you're using is, you want them to feel like they're experiencing it, not like they're being told it, if that makes sense. But I think that's exactly the point with all of this, is that, when you're telling someone something, when it's expositional, when you're just describing things or narrating, for lack of a better term, the person isn't immersed in it. They're not feeling it. They're not experiencing it on any level. They're just kind of taking the information in and analyzing it and having that intellectual response to it. When you're showing them, when they're having that more atavistic, visceral experience of it, it's a completely different way to take in that information. And I think you understand it on a very different level than you do when it's just, that very sort of sterilized information.
Absolutely. To kind of go down that trail a little bit further, may I ask you how that process in 2015, 5 years ago, changed your approach to paganism in that immersive way? Because you've been a pagan since when? The early 90s. So
yeah, I feel so old now. And I was the one that put it in the biography, but I hear early 90s and like cringe. Yes. I was like 11 or 12 when I got into paganism. So, and I had no religion previous to that. So paganism has really been, has been it for me, has been my only thing. But I definitely think that experience in 2016, when I say it was a 180, it really was like everything for me changed without everything changing, which I realize sounds very contradictory, but I had always had the good neighbors, the fairies, as an aspect of what I was doing. They had always been there in one sense or another, just not primarily. I like the majority of neo-pagans out there, it focused on various gods. And at that point in 2016, I had had a strong connection for about a decade with Odin in the Norse pantheon, and then with the Irish gods, with several of them, including the Morrigan and Macha, and some of the more well-known ones there. So this is a decade of working relationship, if you will, and long-term dedication, I guess we could say. And when the initiatory experience happened, I did not want to stop doing that. It wasn't like I had that happen and I was immediately like, okay, now I'm going to change everything. Right. Let's reboot. It was more that I found everything sort of organically becoming something else. My focus on the gods really stopped being a focus, which was actually sort of a painful experience for me, to be honest. That happened over about the 6 months or so after the trip to Ireland. Wow. And it was very hard for me to let it go. Like I didn't want to, but I found that everything that had felt like it was a connection there before, everything that felt responsive, if you will, and powerful and fulfilling, suddenly didn't. It felt like everything was sort of receding, except for the good folk, who suddenly were like taking up a lot more real estate than they had been before. And so I ended up in this place spiritually where my primary focus completely changed to just being on them, to the point that I have talked since about how I am a pagan and I am a witch, but I really don't honor gods anymore per se. I have a different focus on more that like next tier of spirits. But it wasn't anything that I consciously set out to do or intended to do. And as I said, when I was kind of, as we do, going on social media complaining about what has happened to my life, the majority of people who knew me for any length of time were like, well, no, everyone has seen this coming. Like
Interesting, right?
Not me. I
No,
did not see this
no,
coming.
no.
No. But everyone else was like, yeah, no one else is surprised,
Mm.
just me. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, it was a big change.
That's powerful though, and in many ways, it's almost like it would ruin the experience if you were to see it coming. Mm-hmm.
I, you know, I don't know looking back. I like to think
Mm-hmm.
that had I known, I still would have moved forward. Because even though it wasn't planned and I actually didn't know what was happening when it initially started happening. It was a voluntary process. Like at any point I could have been like, I don't want to do this, no, consent is still a thing. And I didn't, I moved forward with it and, it went where it went. And I like to think that if I could go back in time and was aware of what would happen afterwards, that I would still say, yes, I want to do this. But there's a part of me that thinks, if I'm being 100% honest, because it was a very rough period afterwards and it was unnerving and frightening. And, nobody likes having their entire spiritual foundation basically taken apart and then reassembled like Legos.
Yes.
Different shape now, same blocks, different shape. I think that there's a part of me that in that moment, had I known what was going to happen, I definitely would have at least hesitated a lot more than I did. And in the moment, I was very trusting and very like, this is happening for a reason. I'm here for a reason. I'm just going to move forward and see where this goes. Clearly not knowing where it was going. And yeah, I think if I had known where it was going, I would have at least hesitated.
Yes. Yeah. Was there a certain grieving period afterwards?
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's hard when, I realize 10 years in the grand scheme of things is not that long.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it's hard when you've spent 10 years kind of really focused on one spiritual power or, a small group of spiritual powers. And you have kind of built part of your identity around that.
Yes.
Again, I'm not trying to dig too much back into the psychology, but
no, but it's true, right?
Yeah, not just my public identity, but my personal identity. Part of that was based on that I was a priestess of Macha at the time, which is why I was doing the Morrigan trip. It was why I taught classes for the Morrigan's Call retreat, which is how a lot of various things got started. It's hard to have all of that change suddenly, even if you are willing to let it go and you want to kind of move into a new phase. There's still a grieving process with it.
Yes.
Where you have to kind of accept, okay, this isn't who I am anymore. But I'm not sure who I am now. So then you are in that limbo of what is your identity?
Absolutely. It sounds very much like you dove straight into what we in England we would call fairylands, right? That liminal space.
Yep. It felt that way at the time. And again, I suppose, very classic to how it often does happen in the stories, unwittingly wandered into it would be a better way to describe it. Because you do have a lot of stories where people don't realize that they're going into fairy and then, something happens and they're like, oh, all right, I am not in the human world anymore. And yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was definitely the steps forward into it were so tiny, and each one didn't seem to be a significant shift. And so it's hard to even pinpoint the moment when suddenly everything was totally different. I mean, I can pinpoint the sort of the peak of that initiatory experience, and I can kind of pinpoint when it first started. But there were, like I said, it happened over the course of a few days. There were so many things in those few days that were going on, that by the time I really realized what was going on, I was already right at that sort of final point. So
Yeah. And now that final point has passed. I'm assuming that process, at least initially, is over, and you're now into a new phase.
I hope so.
Where is your relationship with those previous deities and entities, Maka and Morrigan, and where is the relationship there?
Basically, what it felt like to me when things were changing was not so much a rejection as a stepping back, which in fairness at the time felt like a rejection, but looking back on it now, I can see that it's not like I can't call on them or pray to them or have a connection to them, because I still do, but that strong feeling of this is hard to describe. I'm trying to think of a way to describe it for people who've never had this sort of approach to spirituality. That strong feeling like you could pray to these powers or call on them, or have a sense of inspiration from them when it comes to creative material, where it's almost like they're always present in some way for you. That has definitely gone. I would have to sort of reach out if I wanted to, and even then it's a more distant sort of perception. Again, we're getting into that territory where it gets hard to verbalize the experience of it without sounding a little delusional, which hopefully I try not to be, but it's just such an ineffable kind of experience.
Yeah. What I'm getting from what you're saying is, and I've been in this in my life, pattern in my life is constant change. And so every 5 years, every 10 years, I seem to cycle through friends. But there are those people who are always in my life, who I can pick up again. And I think most people have those people. But there are other people who, you have such an intense experience with them, but it's very contextual to a particular time in your life. And then you leave that and you see them years later on the street and you're strangers, but you still have that connection from back before. Is it a similar sort of feeling?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I might compare it to like if you've gone to school with someone and you were friends with them all through school, and then you graduate and kind of you go to your career and they go to university or whatever it is they do. And then you see them later on and they're still friends. You can still sort of talk about, oh, remember that time 15 years ago when we did the thing. But that close feeling of intimacy, they're no longer the sort of friend that you would call at 2 a.m. for an emergency or, spill your heart to. It's almost a nostalgic kind of friendship.
It's almost awkward to see them on the street because you don't want them to see you as you are now, right?
Kind of. It just remember me the way I was.
Right? Yeah.
But no, that's a good way to put it. If you can picture that, but with spirituality.
Absolutely. It's relationship, right? Relationship is relationship. Yeah. And so your relationship now with the good people, I've read your books, you describe it in there, but for those listeners who may be coming from a very different kind of very deity centric approach to relationship, was very focused on a particular individual. Can you speak a little bit about what your relationship is like to this mass kind of grouping other individuals? Is it an approach to a specific, what's that relationship?
Sure. And I do sort of preface this when the subject comes up by saying that even though there is some overlap with the good folk and gods, and there is this sort of blurry area where we have some of the named, particularly the fairy kings and fairy queens, who are also known to be gods. And so it gets a little complicated. for the most part, when we're talking about the good folk, we're not talking about deities. It's a very different situation. It's a very different relationship, if you will. Most people, when we talk about gods, we are talking about a sort of relationship where there is sort of an implicit, particularly I should say in Western neo-paganism, there's sort of an implicit safety net, I guess we would say. Like there's a feeling, and you'll see a lot of people talk about this, that, you know, the gods are closely connected to care about them, and that anything that gets thrown their way that's difficult or troubling is a lesson and something that can be overcome or worked through, that they're cared for, basically. There's a lot of analogies for the gods to being like parents, whether it's strict parents or not, and, you know, that sort of thing. And when we're talking about the good folk, it is a very, very different sort of situational relationship. Even for someone like me who has kind of found themselves, you know, intentionally or not very immersed in it, they are not, they're not in that same sort of parental place that we tend to view deities, for various reasons. And again, we could probably spend the entire rest of this interview just analyzing why it is that Western neo-pagans tend to have that sort of relationship with gods. But it's a little hard to compare to any sort of human kind of relationship, without it sounding unhealthy, and it isn't, and I don't mean it to sound that way, so I want to be careful how I say this now. But they have certain expectations, certain work that they want done, certain things along those lines, and they tend, just by the nature of what they are, to be very rigid, I guess we would say. If you have an agreement, for example, with a god, let's say you tell Brigid, the goddess Brige, that you are going to try to do this devotional work for her, and you're going to try to do it by her holiday of February 1st. And something happens and you're very sick and you can't get it done. So you go to her and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You know, I need an extension," basically. Generally speaking, with the gods, that's going to be fine.
Right.
You know, as long as you're legitimately ill and not you're just lazy and didn't do it, that might be slightly different. But generally, you know, that'll be fine. With the good folk, they have a much more legalistic kind of approach to things. This is my personal experience. This is also like the entire corpus of folklore. If you say, "Okay, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to make this offering to you at this time. I'm going to do this work, whatever it is, by this amount of time," there are no excuses. You can't kind of say, "Well, I got sick and all of this life stuff happened and I just couldn't get it done," because they don't care.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they don't. Yeah, I'm not saying they don't care like in a callous way. It's more of a, you know, not their problem, kind of a way. You agreed to do a thing, you need to do the thing. In the same sense that if they agree to do a thing, they will do that. So, which is a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. But, you know, so my connection to them, the way I often describe it, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, is, you know, that I work for them. Whereas, you know, the majority of people who talk about being a priest or a priestess, they talk about it in the context of serving the human community. I talk about being a priestess of the good folk in the sense that I serve them. I do things that need to be done. And obviously that is open to a lot of interpretation, whether people agree that that is what I'm doing or whether it actually does need to be done. But that's where I'm coming from with it. This idea that there are certain things that they want and then I try to do them. But, you know, there's this idea that kind of goes around that I've seen people talk about, that if you are particularly a witch, but also a pagan who works with the good folk, you have some kind of layer of protection from them. I do not find that to be true. And I say that as someone who has had a connection to them pretty much my entire life and been a priestess to them for 5 years. I once was working on a book for Mananan, actually, and was getting ready for a trip to Ireland, and was getting some very clear messages, spiritual messages, that I needed to put the book on hold. It was almost done. I had plenty of time before it was due. I just wanted to finish it. Put the book on hold and focus on getting ready for the trip, because there were some important things, otherworldly, fairy things that needed to be focused on while I was in Ireland for that trip. And of course, I'm a stubborn person. I was like, no, I can get this done, and then also have time to the other. I went temporarily blind for 3 days.
Oh, a very common thing.
I do not recommend, by the way. Yes, very like straight out of the folklore. I did go to the doctor. I put this out there for everyone watching this interview. Always get things medically checked. Don't just assume there's supernatural causes. I did go, actually I went to the emergency room here where I am, and was basically told that they had no explanation, that I had an unidentified eye infection, but that they didn't know what was causing it, or, much about it. So they gave me some ointment to use, sent me home, and said, if it doesn't get better, come back or go to a specialist. And for 3 days, I basically could not see. And I went through what we might call a dark night of the soul of sorts, but it was more of a, do I want to be a stubborn, independent sort of person and try to do what I want to do, even when I'm being pretty clearly shown that that's not what they want me to do? Or do I just want to do what they want me to do?
Yes.
And I finally was sort of like, all right, this was in 2018, by the way. So this was 2 years after the initiatory experience. And I was finally like, you know what, I will just, I will do what I'm supposed to be doing here and not what I want to be doing. And I woke up the next day and I could see perfectly.
Yes.
Whatever it was gone. So I mostly blame myself for that whole incident, but I'm telling the story to kind of illustrate that, like, they didn't hesitate to do that. I am very fortunate it was not permanent, because that is normally what they do to people. There wasn't any idea that because I had some kind of special connection to them, I was like immune.
That's the thing, right? Yeah.
I had something else happen in 2019, slightly similar, where I had a feeling I needed to do something and I really, really did not want to do it for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here. And I ended up I get migraines, I should say, but I ended up getting the worst migraine I've ever had in my entire life. And I have had them since I was a teenager.
I know what they feel like.
It was atrocious, horrifically atrocious. And I do not say that lightly, because like I say, I've had them for decades, and I am kind of used to them at this point, but that was honestly the worst one I've ever had in my entire life. And it was pretty clear that it was them, being like, you need to do what you're told to do. And again, I realize out of context, this sounds unhealthy and abusive, which I want to be clear about, because I know there's a lot of discussion in spiritual communities about gods and healthy relationships and consent. There's multiple things to understand with this, though, that first of all, this is the nature of these beings.
Yes.
This is who and what they are. Don't interact with them if you're not willing to accept that this is who and what they are. I did voluntarily, whether I understood what I was volunteering for or not, I did voluntarily enter into this. And I, particularly me, with my knowledge of the folklore and of their nature, I am perfectly aware of these consequences and what I am opening myself up to when I refuse to do particular things. So,
yes.
Just to be clear for everyone listening right now, but that's a huge difference, I think, between being connected to them and being a priestess for them and interacting with the gods or being connected to the gods.
Yes.
They are much more results oriented, I guess we'll say.
Well, but I mean, that's the thing, right? I'm no stranger to the folklore myself, and there's a commonality amongst all the so-called Celtic nations, the folklore of all of those, where they are very giving but they are very easy to take away when slighted. I think when you were talking, I was thinking of the famous tale from the market of Milford Haven in Wales, where the fair folk, Plantanun, would come out of the sea and go and buy things at market, and eventually they started favoring a very particular stall there. And when the other stalls started to realize that all of them were prospering because of this one stall, they raised their prices, and the fair folk were like, well, F you, and then they went down to the next town, but punishing the one that they favored in the same time, right?
Yep.
It's a very different part of my own spiritual background is Lukumi Orisha tradition, and the Orishas are they remind me very much of the Celtic fairy tradition, in that they are representations of the landscape. And when it comes to the landscape, the land, the natural elements of the world, right? They're unforgiving. If they expect you to do something, or you'll get a flood. And it's just that's just cause and effect. It strikes me that that's very similar to kind of the Celtic fairy approach in general. Like I know there are specific kind of approaches in different areas among the different groups.
That's sort of widespread.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. And they do have blessing aspects. They do have healing. I don't mean aspects in the more neo-pagan goddess kind of way. They will bless people. They will heal. I've had healing experiences with them. I have a lot of things in my life that I deeply appreciate that I think come from them. But I think it's important to understand that there's that balance there, that there's the good, but there's also consequences to particular things. And I think that when we're looking at sort of that bigger picture, I've seen them compared to like the Japanese kami. I've seen them compared to the Orishas. I don't know as much about the Orishas, obviously, but I think that's a fair comparison. The idea that if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, if you're not breaking prohibitions, if you are sort of following their rules, their specific rules, then things will go well for you. But when you are not doing what you're supposed to be doing, then there's going to be consequences for that. And sometimes those consequences are severe.
But they're always there as a lesson. It's all, my own kind of journey when it comes to spiritual beings has been really to understand that they have a very different sense of time from us. So although, a crippling car accident that's going to put you in a wheelchair for 10 years, to them is just a blip, it's just a slap on and it's not a callous thing. It's just the timeline is so different.
It's perspective.
Right? Yeah, but it really forces you to really think ahead. It's almost like that, all those stories of when the ferryman approaches and says, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a dirty farmyard, or would you want to have a clean farmyard? The stupid individual will say the clean farmyard, because then they don't have to do so much work, and then all of their cows disappear, right?
Yep. And then it's clean because there's no animals.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that that's another thing for me with the shift from focusing more on the gods previously to now being entirely focused on the fair folk is, with the gods, there does seem to be more of an understanding of human limitations and human time.
Right.
So, if you go to the gods, I don't know if it's because the gods are much more connected to and interacting with humanity. Again, we can get into a whole conversation just about symbiotic relationships between humanity and gods, but there's an understanding, if you go to the gods and pray for like, I need healing for this, but you're not specific. You're just like, I just need this healed. The gods are going to fill in those blanks and be like, okay, well, you mean soon or immediately, and you mean healing as in to health. Whereas if you go to the good folk and you're too vague and say, I need healing for this, there's a lot of ways they can take that. And they might, okay, healing, but it's going to come in a year
Right.
or 2 years, because like you said, to them, that's nothing.
Yeah.
That is soon.
Yeah.
Or, you could die, because then you're healed and you're not sick anymore.
Right.
I mean, you're
Right.
dead, which is inconvenient for you if you don't want to be, but from their perspective, that you got what you were wanting.
Yes.
Particularly depending on how you phrase things. And I've said this before in classes I was teaching, that when we try to understand the perspective of the good folk, we need to try to imagine, because it's hard for us. If you see a lot of analogies of like they're like trees, or they're like glaciers or whatever, so that's too hard. Imagine that you as a human are one of the good folk, and you have a pet mouse, and that is a human. It's going to live for 2 or 3 years, which for your lifetime is nothing. It's a very short amount of time. And it's your pet, so you care about it, but you also sort of care about it in the way that you care about anything that's going to live for 2 or 3 years, which I guess sounds a little callous on my part, but it's fairly fleeting in a temporal sense. And then you're going to do things. It's going to live in a cage, and you're going to have to take it out sometimes and clean the cage. And from the mouse's perspective, this could be a horrifying disruption and very frightening, or who knows.
Mm-hmm.
But from your perspective, you understand why it's being done, and therefore it's necessary. And if it's upsetting to the mouse in the moment, you may or may not try to mitigate that, but you're still going to do what you feel needs to be done.
Right.
And that's how the fair folk are with
Right.
humans. We are the mice in that analogy. And some of them definitely have much more of an approach of extermination towards mice.
Right.
And others are much more the, it's going to be a favorite pet that sits on your shoulder and, gets coddled for the brief time it's here. But if you can understand that shift in perspective, I think that helps a lot in trying to deal with them.
So on that note, then, how has that affected your approach to life in general, then? That paradigm shift in approach, how has that affected your life?
I'll be honest. I mean, it's always better to be honest anyway, but
always.
I actually have a much harder time now with the concept of time, because I think I've gotten a little too much into that mindset of, what's a decade in the grand scheme of things? What's a few years? It's when you're dealing with beings for whom 100 years is a relatively short amount of time. 100 years to them is not really that long, at least from my understanding of it. And when you're constantly dealing with that, it's hard not to fall into that a little bit yourself. So I have been known to talk about like the Victorian era stuff, which I have a huge pet peeve about the Victorian era in general, but as if it was like very recent. Yeah, all of it. We really could talk about it for a whole hour too. But I have a habit of talking about that like it was very recent. Like, I'll talk about the modern era in general, which is, what we're living in, but also goes back quite a ways at this point, as if it's all very recent, and obviously in a historical perspective it is, but, from a human perspective, probably not so much, but it's hard not to get into that mindset. And that's definitely something that I did not have an issue with when I was previously, when I was more deity focused. It was much more like, you want to enjoy the moment, embrace the cycles of the earth, and, enjoy the time you have. Right. And now it's like time has become meaningless. There is no time. It also does not help that in 2018, I shifted from using a more agrarian solar holiday cycle to one based on constellations. Because that also, because it's so divorced from the sort of real world fingers in the dirt kind of cycle, it's got a very different perspective. And I'm looking at like the progression of constellations across like tens of thousands of years to try to date certain things. And that will also mess with your head.
I can imagine. It's something's triggering here. I think I read something by Yuri Leach, who spoke a little bit about that as well. Very similar kind of, it changes your perspective totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. I don't think there's a way to avoid that. And it's not to say I'm not grounded in a very, tangible reality, consensual, tangible reality, to be clear. Because I have children. I'm a single parent. I have to make sure they get up to go to school. I have to make sure I go grocery shopping and pay bills and all of that. So, I do have that much of a grasp of time, but in the wider sense, like when I stop and think about that initiation experience, it seems like it just happened.
Right.
But it was 5 years ago. When I stop and think about how long have I been writing, it seems like it hasn't been that long. It's been 11 years now.
Yeah.
But all of this just everything feels very immediate and recent.
Right. I think that's something that I've certainly noticed in my own life over the past almost 2 years now. Like we are coming to almost to 2 years of this pandemic. And there are times where, like I just moved into my apartment, but it was a year ago. But I feel like I just moved in, There is that, but that's the essence of time. That's the delusion of time, is that time is something that we slap a continuum onto and say, okay, this is how we're measuring it. But when you don't have that measuring, then what is, like looking at the constellations, for example, I was reading something the other day, and apparently we have, when you think about the galaxy, our planet and our sun has only 12 revolutions around the galactic core until we explode. But that's like a few billion years, right?
Yeah.
So.
But it's all about perspective.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think I'm trying to remember who said it. I believe it was German philosopher Kant. Time and space exist only in our minds. And I think that it's easy to sort of forget that time is in a lot of ways a human conceit.
Yes.
It is something that we have created. Minutes, seconds, hours, those are things that we invented.
Yes.
In order to measure.
Exactly.
If we actually were mice, we would not care.
Yes.
Because you do what you do and you go about your life and it lasts as long as it lasts. Humans do have a very interesting obsession with measuring and wanting to know exactly how long has it been. How long have you been alive? How long have you been working this job? We're very invested in this idea of time as sort of an objective concept. And I honestly, I'm going to offend every physicist out there. I honestly don't know that it is objective, or maybe not. Maybe they'll agree with me. I think
I am not sure. I think quantum physics would say, "Oh no, it's not objective. It's totally subjective." Yeah.
Well, as soon as I said it, I'm like, actually, I feel like I have read something talking about the subjective nature of time. Although even from a psychology point of view, the subjective nature of time is very easy to illustrate based on it. Yeah, if you're enjoying something, how quickly does it go by? Versus if you are not enjoying something, how slowly do you? This is all perception.
Totally.
It actually, the amount of time that passes is going to be the same. If objective time exists, we'll just put it that way.
Well, and this is the thing, and when bringing that back to kind of the fairy people, the good people, in many of the traditions, their world is a pleasure world. It's filled with pleasure. It's filled with all the good things, right? And their time, of course, goes much faster in that world than here. People who are unfortunate enough to stumble in, and then 300 years later, they stumble back out and turn to dust, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's actually, that's a very interesting point. tying everything we just said back into the good folk, yes, their concept of time would inherently have to be different from the human one because it works differently for them. We also have stories of people who go, Catherine Briggs records this one in one of her books of a gentleman who went into Fairyland and lived for years. Basically he was staying in this one town, and there was a fountain in the town. And the one thing he was told, because there's always a prohibition, that there always is one thing that you're not allowed to do. And so he was told, you are not allowed to drink water from this one fountain. Anything else you want to do, go ahead, have fun. But you cannot touch this. And so he lived there for years, very happily by his account. And then of course, finally one day, couldn't resist, or however it happened, and ended up drinking the water, touching the water, and was immediately thrown back to earth. But he was thrown back to earth about 5 minutes after he'd initially left.
Interesting.
Which was enormously upsetting and jarring for him, because now he has this memory of these years of living, which he cannot reconcile with the people around him who are like, well, no, you've barely left. Like you just, it was like 5 minutes. And we see that the same thing with the people like you had just referenced, who are gone for, sometimes it's not 300 years, sometimes it's 10, but they come back after what they thought was one night, and it's been 10 years. And they almost always in the stories waste away and die within a few months, because they just can't seem to come back from that. And if you think about how mentally difficult it would be to have that to try to reconcile, like your mind is trying to tell you, no, it's only been one night, but everyone around you is 10 years older, everything is different. How do you come to terms with that?
It's that classic scene from Captain America where he wakes up and the woman comes in dressed in clothing that looks just like his own, and he then notices the calendar on the wall, and it's like a month earlier or a month later, whatever it was, and he goes ballistic, because then suddenly the valley of the uncanny kind of dawns on him, and he realizes, I don't know what I would do in that situation.
I don't know, honestly, that any of us could anticipate what we would do. I did have one experience myself where I will say I'm one of those people who believes that we sometimes have dreams that are not dreams, that are actually soul journey experiences where we go somewhere else. And I had what I believe was one of those experiences where several months went by, and then I, of course, woke up and that had not happened. And it took me several days of constantly telling myself, like, no, this is what day it is. I've been here the whole time. But it was very jarring and very unnerving. And I can't imagine doing that on a scale of years, because that was relatively a shorter kind of thing to try to come to terms with. I don't know how people do it who, are unconscious for lengths of time. Not that it's very common, despite what the movies tell us, not that it's very common to be in a coma for 10 years and wake up.
No, it's not very common. No.
Usually it does not work that way.
No.
But, the human mind just does not seem to deal well with that sort of discontinuity.
Yes.
Or Uncanny Valley,
or Uncanny Valley, yes. Yeah, which is a whole other topic that I'm sure you have because the Uncanny Valley comes into your urban fantasy a lot, doesn't it?
Yep, Uncanny Valley it comes into urban fantasy. It also comes into fairy lore in general, particularly anecdotal accounts. I think a lot of times what happens when people have encounters, because despite what media tells us, the majority of the good folk we're going to run into look very human, but there's always that uncanny valley. There's always there's always something that's not right. And eventually it gets unnerving enough that the human in the equation either leaves or gets upset, or something happens. There was a story that was recounted on YouTube, which I mentioned because I always try to ground this in these things still happen and are modern occurrences.
Totally.
This was a gentleman relating a story on YouTube where he had left a bar one night, ran into a gentleman who was asking him to kind of help him find some temporary companionship, we shall say. And of course, he was like, no, I can't. He was a bartender, and he got in at work. I was heading home. And he kept walking, and all of a sudden, a block or two later, the same man is in front of him again. And again is like, can you help me, find a girl? And he's getting a little unnerved. He's like, no, I already told you I can't. And he keeps going. And I believe he'd crossed a bridge. Something had happened where it was physically impossible at this point for the person to have in any way run or gotten ahead of him without being seen. And again, he came upon this person.
Wow.
And at this point, he was already getting upset because, again, it's Uncanny Valley. Your mind knows this is not physically possible. And the same conversation, him saying no. And at this point, he was getting upset enough. I believe from the account, he said he was almost in tears. And he ran to the only thing that was open. It was like 3 a.m, which was like a overnight fast food restaurant kind of thing, if I remember correctly. And he goes in the door, and the man is sitting at a table right inside the door and looks up as soon as he comes in and repeats the same, like, help me find a girl. And the guy said he turned and he just ran, like crying, ran all the way back to his apartment because he was just terrified at that point. He was like, there's no physical explanation for what is happening right now. It makes no sense. And your brain just tries to reject it. Like, this is not actually happening, which is that uncanny valley. Like, this is not possible. It kicks in those survival instincts.
Oh, completely. That reptilian brain. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, fight or flight, definitely. Yep. Yeah. And that actually, I mean, that's a whole other conversation too, is how, when you look at urban legends and things that happen, not just urban legends, but things that are recounted now, how similar they are to older stories, even going back to ancient mythology, right? Very similar, very, very similar. I've had experiences like that myself. I think when pressed, I think most people have had experiences that they don't want to own up to because, yeah. I am actually looking at the time and talking about enjoying this conversation so much. The time has flown. So if you'll indulge me one last question, and then I have a congratulations for you. Throughout your process over the past 5 years since that moment of change, what have you learned about yourself?
I think I've learned a couple things about myself. I think I've learned that I'm a lot more stubborn, even to my own detriment, than I had thought I was, which is a strength and a weakness. I guess I always knew that I was determined, that I was good at, like, if something needed to be done, I would find a way if it could be done. But I definitely, since going through that, have realized that once I kind of set my mind to something, for good or ill, I am going to stick it out, which I am still kind of processing that a little bit, because I think I need to work on the downside to that. There are points when I definitely, to quote a movie from the 1990s that is going to be obscure, some people might recognize it, I tilt when I should withdraw. All you Heath Ledger fans out there. Not that he's the one who said it, but I have a habit of, even when I should not do a thing or should pull back from a thing, hence why I went blind for 3 days or got that terrible migraine. Like, I will dig my heels in with things where I really should instead give it some thought and make a better life choice. And I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would not have had that perspective on myself. I think that I'm a lot more honest at this point about my flaws and my skills than I used to be. Yes. But again, because the good folk are very humbling to interact with. They are not the gods who are trying to lift you up and help you be better.
You're amazing. You're great. Accept it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not. Well, you are amazing and you should accept it. That part's true. But yeah, whereas the gods will say that the good folk are much more acerbic, we'll just say. So, and I think kind of not just on a spiritual level, but on a personal level with my writing, I think I've had so many people at this point tell me that I'm good at making complex subjects understandable and relating them in an easy to understand way. And I don't think I had believed that before.
Right.
But I do think I've heard it enough at this point.
That is in there.
Yeah. That I'm starting to think, you know what, maybe that is something I'm good at. Maybe that's part of why they chose me. Because I'm good at getting a complicated message out in a simple way.
But I mean, that's the thing. There needs to be more of that. And 39 books later, a lot of them non-fiction spirituality books, there needs to be that, and that attention to detail. One thing that always strikes me, as I said at the beginning, was not only your attention to detail, but your attention to authenticity. We were talking before the recording about how, being writers, being out there on social media, we sometimes need to be a little bit more careful about what we put out there. But when it comes to ranting about things that we really disagree with, sometimes it's just the best thing to do it, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I think that there's a genuineness. I'm about to have a little rant. Here we go.
Go ahead.
I think that there's a genuineness that is missing in a lot of social media, because people try to cultivate an image or, a perception of their social media presence, an identity, if you will, that is very positive, or that only, does encouraging or says encouraging things. And I think that, for me, I would rather be genuine, even if I'm saying, oh no, this is upsetting and this is horrible. And, Victorians, I rant about the Victorians quite a bit. The damage that they have done. But I think that, sometimes it's better for us to be genuine and to acknowledge the good and the bad and kind of where we're at with everything. And I think part of why I am like that is because I've seen it too often in communities. Toxic positivity is what it's called, where people only focus on the positive, but then that negative still is in there, but it's in there and it's coded in such a way and disguised in such a way that it's almost more vicious.
Yes.
And then it puts people in a position where you can't defend yourself or have a conversation because it was positive to begin with. So then you become the one who's picking a fight and having an issue.
Yes.
I think it's better to just be straightforward and have an actual conversation. And, we don't all have to agree. It's perfectly fine to have different opinions and disagree. But we can do it in a more genuine and honest manner, as opposed to trying to always seem like perfect,
That's the thing.
which we're not.
No, that's exactly it. Social media has not been helpful to that, because now with the block button, when we do see things that kind of invade our echo chamber, we can just block it off and delete it and live in whatever state we want to. It's not been positive. Yeah.
Yep. And when people say things we don't like or disagree with us, we can just delete the comment and block the person and, sort of cultivate this idea that everything we say is wonderful and everyone agrees with us. And, I would much rather say something and be called out for it and learn something from that and be able to say, okay, I realize now that my original perspective was skewed or based in, whatever. And I see it differently now and be able to change it than to have that fake, that fakeness,
Exactly.
I had once said something about, I don't believe in writer's block. because I can't afford to believe in it, which is true for myself. But I was very rightly called out for that by someone who said that that is a very privileged viewpoint, that a lot of people get writer's block for very legitimate reasons, including depression.
Okay,
ADD,
so we're just
other
gonna do some
things
audio
that
recording here, and I
very
think I'm
legitimate,
peaking by the
and
looks
that
of
it's
it.
wrong
So we're
for
just gonna
me
breathe.
to make a comment like that, which is damaging and implies that those people are somehow flawed or wrong.
Right.
And I sat back and thought about it. I'm like, you know what? You're right.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have said that. And, you know, just because I'm speaking from my perspective and that's my mindset does not mean that I have a right to make it sound like nobody else is entitled, you know, or allowed to have this without their somehow being lazy or whatever the implication was. And I didn't delete any of the comments. I left everything up. And I mean, was it embarrassing? Of course it's a little embarrassing. Nobody likes getting called out.
No, not at all.
You know, but it was a great point and it was a great conversation and I learned something from it. And I would much rather have that sort of a social media presence than the alternative.
And I will say, I mean, I've been following your work for years now, but I only just added you to Facebook earlier this year. I've noticed that you are very gracious when it comes to your social media, for your personal and your author page, when it comes to that. But it's funny because I see that the people you have on there tend to be that way as well. They're very gracious. They tend to be, even when calling you out. I remember that post, even the call out was still, it was not, it was a mature conversation, right? Yeah, it was a mature conversation.
I like to think that I like to think, ideally, that when we try to cultivate that sort of an environment where we're saying, you know, it is okay to call out things, you know, but we're not encouraging it to that level of, you know, get up on a soapbox and start vilifying the person. People don't learn from that. You know, nobody's going to learn if your response is immediately to start, you know, ad hominem attacking them. But if you're like, well, listen, actually, this is, you know, what you're saying is damaging and this is why, and you should reconsider. You know, I would like to think anyway that most people then would take a step back and say, oh, okay, you know, actually, you know, let's have an actual dialogue here. And I think, again, that a lot of times what happens on social media is not dialogue. People don't listen. They just speak. And I would, yep. And I like to encourage and I like to engage in myself in dialogue. Even if I don't agree with you, that's fine. But I like to hear your thoughts and your opinions and where you're coming from. For the most part, I will say that we get into like conspiracy theory stuff and anti-Semitism, transphobic stuff that I'm not going to be okay with.
And
like,
fairies are daily.
That I don't tolerate. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah. But like civilized conversation, I am in favor of.
That really is the way of the future. I'm hoping that we are leading that way and not the opposite way. I really do.
I hope so.
Well, we are well over time, and I appreciate you indulging my questions today. And it's been an absolute joy, Morgan. It's been lovely to actually connect with you in person here.
This has been a lot of fun.
I hope that you'll come back. I'm hoping to do a panel discussion at some point, so maybe you'll join Mara on a panel discussion at some point.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah, that would be
really fun.
I do want to offer some congratulations because I noticed on your Facebook wall today that your book, Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk, is officially a bestseller through your publisher. So I want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
You just found that out today?
I did. I just found that out this morning. Yeah, I'm very excited. I have a couple that are bestsellers for them, but mostly Pagan Portals, which are the shorter books. My Fairies, Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk is one of my longer books. And it's one of the ones I'm very proud of. I like to think that it's useful and helpful to people. So yeah, I was very excited to see that one's doing so well.
That's awesome. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
So I'll give you a chance to put a plug in. What is the next book that's coming out for you?
My next book that's coming out is Pantheons the Norse, which comes out next April, I believe. And that's sort of a basic introduction to modern heathenry and the Norse gods. It's part of a series that my publisher's doing. And then sometime around July or August of next year, I have Pagan Portals Ace She, which I realize I'm adding in as an extra plug here, but this is probably the book that I'm the most proud of writing. I really put a lot of effort and heart into it. I did say that when the New Dictionary of Fairies came out, and I do love that book too, but this one I think is probably the most important thing I've ever written. So
perfect. Is that open for pre-order yet?
Not yet.
Not
I
yet,
will
okay.
I will share links when it is.
Perfect.
But it's gotten some really good endorsements, which is always a good sign for me. And I feel like it's going to be a very important book. Not to sound egotistical, because I don't mean it that way, but I feel like it will be. There's not a great deal out there that is just about the Irish good folk. Yeah. They always tend to get kind of lumped in, and everything's sort of that broad picture. So this will be one of the few things that'll be on the market that's specifically just aimed at that.
Well, that's the thing. There is a bit written about them, but it's always behind a paywall. I know Jenny Butler has put a load out, or at least a little bit out. But again, if you don't have a JSTOR account, or you're not, attending an academic institution, there's nothing there, right? So, yep. I will definitely be interested in seeing that, because, like you said, so much is written from that English-centric point of view, where any other country in that archipelago is lumped in. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So if people want to get a hold of you, I'll put the links down below, but what's the best way that people can find out more about you and get a hold of you?
Well, I am on social media, as we've established. I do have a Facebook author page. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I do have a Tumblr account, but that's sort of my secret. If you can figure out where I am on Tumblr, and you get a shiny gold star. Everything is under my name, Morgan Daimler, except for my Tumblr account. Okay. That's why it's my sort of secret account. It's not subtle, though. If you do find it, trust me, you'll realize it's me.
It's too funny. It's too funny. It's too
funny. And of course, with my books, it's Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pretty much any mainstream bookseller. Brick and mortar, if they don't have it, if you ask, they can usually get them. So except for my fiction, I will say that I self-publish, so that generally you're going to have to go through Amazon. I'm sorry. I know how much everyone loves that, but
it's the way, right? Self-publishing, it's not as yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Unfortunately for self-publishing, Amazon is one of the better options if you want to actually have your product reach an audience. So yeah, I'm sorry for all of you that absolutely hate anything go through that source, but
you have to do what you have to do. You have to do what you have to do. I will put all those links down in the bottom. And again, thank you so much for coming on and indulging all my questions. And thank you for sharing more personal aspects of your story. If you are interested in Morgan's work, as I said, look down at the links below, and keep an eye out for some of the upcoming books. That will be book 40 and 41, if we're keeping track.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I loved the questions.
Absolutely. And I hope you'll come back.
Definitely.
Thank you.